All right. Chillcast MMA. All right. Chillcast MMA. And I'm joined once again by John Nash of Bloody Elbow and Show Money Podcast. And you guys know how I like to do. I like to hop right into the topics. So we'll just get right to it. So, John, how are you today?
Pretty good. It's Mother's Day, so I called my mom. Got that out of the way. So I'm doing good. I'm on the good side of my mom. So
That's always a good thing. So, I guess before we get into it, right quick, how'd you enjoy the fights yesterday? UFC 237 was going on. Bellator had an event. How'd you enjoy the fights?
uh I tried to put I mean there was a lot yesterday, so I didn't end up watching live the pay-per-view, the UFC pay-per-view. I watched the prelims when I was at the gym because they play them there. I watched the Fox boxing card. I watched later in the night. I watched the ESPN boxing card, the main and co-main, the two title fights, and I watched the last three fights of Bellator, and then I finally ended up catching the Aldo and the Rose versus Andrade fight. So it's that's a full day right there. So that's like 12 fights I watched. So, but they're all pretty. I lucked out in a sense that I think I missed most of the fights people were complaining about that were boring.
Yeah, definitely. There was a lot of fodder in there. I don't really know how else to word it, but I got you. So, all right, trying to get right into some of these topics. So the first thing that comes to mind right off top is ESPN and the UFC. It was announced roughly last month or not that long ago that one, they were going to add on 2 years to the current deal that they have, which would extend it to 7 years. And they would be taking all of the pay-per-views and moving that behind ESPN Plus. So when you got that press release or heard that news through whichever channels, what was your initial reaction to that, just as a whole?
Well, I was a little surprised. I mean, I don't know if I think on your show even previous we've talked about how my idea was the UFC is always going to keep the pay-per-views as a bundle. And I thought they would eventually sell it as programming for, a large amount of money. But I guess what they want is probably too large for anybody just to put it on a regular show. They still have to sell it as pay-per-view. So I wasn't surprised they did something with that package. I was surprised the ESPN deal because it basically came out of nowhere. The last we'd heard is that they were negotiating with the pay-per-view providers for higher splits, and they were going back and forth on that. So it was a little surprising that they came to a deal with ESPN to take it, and that ESPN would be continuing them as pay-per-view products instead of putting them on, ESPN Plus. But obviously they're tying them into ESPN Plus because the purpose of the deal is to get more subscribers.
Yeah. So I guess to trying to dig into that a little bit deeper, one of the first things that I sort of noticed was the leverage. People like you and Paul Gibb, Luke Thomas, and others, they made a big deal about leverage, saying that guys like Brock Lesnar that may or may not have played a role in his decision making to retire. There's questions about guys like Conor McGregor. What are they going to do from a leverage standpoint? So, um, since we have you here, I'd like you to try and explain that. Like, what is that when we talk about this leverage that fighters are losing? What is that leverage? And um, from ESPN's perspective, what role do they play in all of this moving forward, in your opinion?
Well, I think some people have jumped the gun saying that fighters are losing leverage with the deal. They're not losing leverage. They're just not gaining leverage. I think people assumed because ESPN needs, is paying for this, that they're going to want big hit pay-per-views, that ESPN is going to go out of their way to demand the biggest fighters on the pay-per-views. And so they'll have leverage to force the UFC to paying more to get them on those pay-per-views. But that ignores the fact that there's already a model in place that the UFC has all the leverage to begin with, and they've already set the prices that they're willing to pay for, and they won't change that. So to me, it wasn't the UFC, the fighters lost leverage to the UFC. My point is the fighters are at the same point they have. They have some leverage the UFC, but most of it overwhelmingly is in the UFC's hands. The UFC, because they're a repeat player, because it's a long-term deal, even with Conor McGregor, because they're not dependent on any fighter to make their revenue figures that they need. Like if you went to boxing, Golden Boy would basically wither up and die without Canelo Alvarez fighting. They might survive, but they'd suddenly go from one of the major promoters to minor promoter. And you see that with a lot of the promotions that that they're dependent on a handful of stars to actually fight. That's where they make the revenue. If they don't fight, that promotion would wither up and die. The UFC doesn't have to worry about that. They have guaranteed revenue coming in. They easily make profits even if a Conor McGregor doesn't fight. So as much as they want Brock and Conor to fight, if those guys change the model structure where they're asking for more than the UFC wants to give them, and probably deservedly, they deserve more because they bring in so much money. But still, the UFC says, we only want to give you set percent maximum of our revenue. If you ask for more than that, we're willing to sit out and wait, because it's worse for us in the long run to break this model and let other fighters start asking for that than to just wait until you give in because you have no other options, or until someone else steps up to take your place as a star because we're a repeat player. Eventually, we'll make our money back. Eventually, a new star will come in that'll make the money, or you will give up your holdout and come back and fight, and we'll get that revenue anyways.
Do you think, what are your thoughts on, from a matchmaking perspective, how do you think that'll affect it? Because it seems like, if the UFC can now set a hard line in the sand because of some of the reasons you just mentioned, do you think that could affect matchmaking in the future, where we'll see more pay-per-views similar to what we saw last night with Rose Namajunas and Jessica Andrade? Is there a trickle-down effect there, is basically what I'm asking?
Well, matchmaking-wise, I think because the UFC now has guaranteed revenue, the one thing is they're not as dependent on, I guess, hotshot matchmaking between, I'm just trying to think of a fight out of nowhere, but between, I guess more the freak show element, people would call it, where a fight's just made because it'll sell pay-per-views. They're not as dependent on it because now they have guaranteed revenue, a lot more of it. So I see, and also this is just my gut feeling based on what I've seen so far from the UFC and from ESPN. My gut feeling is the UFC is not going to give up control of their matchmaking because they're very protective of that. But as a system of quality control for ESPN, they're basically going to, my guess is they're going to tell ESPN when they sign this deal that all the pay-per-views are going to have the title fights. The title fights will only be on pay-per-views, and that every pay-per-view event will have a title fight on it, at least one. And that'll be their quality control. That way ESPN knows, oh yeah, the biggest fights are the title fights. They're guaranteed on these pay-per-views, and everyone will have one. And so what that means is it's going to be more, it'll be less, like I said, less the gimmicky fights, even though some of them are interesting, like Nick Diaz versus Anderson Silva, and more just who's the up-and-coming contender title fight. I think you'll see more of that.
Yeah, and another thing, or another aspect that recently sort of came out that I hadn't necessarily thought about was the pay-per-view buys. Various reports came out saying that UFC 236, which was the first pay-per-view under this new model, it came in at roughly around 100,000 buys, 100K buys. So do you think that, like, what are your opinions on that? Like, how will this sort of affect the buying rate of these pay-per-views? Just from a fan perspective, like, some people, they may want to buy the pay-per-view, but, downloading ESPN Plus and making sure, like, okay, I have that, and then taking the step forward to buy it, that may be a bridge too far for some people. So for the fans' perspective, do you think there's a trickle-down effect there where that could affect business in the long run? Or do you think eventually, like ESPN touted that 2 million number, do you think that just over time people are going to get on board with the program and things will get back to normal as usual? Or is that 100K range, is that sort of the new norm moving forward?
Well, I think it's too early to tell. For one reason is because no one's confirmed that number. I mean, even Dave Meltzer, I think he brought it up originally and said that was, just a number he heard. It didn't come from a real source. It could change. So we don't know if that 100,000 is for real. Plus, all the estimates before, generally, when you see the actual, listings that the UFC has when they were sending out documents to the lenders or to the potential buyers that have pay-per-view numbers, they're always about 10 to 15% lower than what the estimates were. So that's one thing we got to remember, is that we don't know for sure if that number yet is accurate. Well, let's pretend it is. It's very possible that was a one-time thing because they weren't really set up right, and so many people were unfamiliar, weren't aware yet that you have to go through ESPN Plus to get it, and they had problems with ESPN Plus. So long term, that might be fixed, that more and more people will figure it out. More and more people will already subscribe to ESPN Plus. It'll be easier in the future. So that's a strong possibility. The other thing to think about too is, as much as it's the other thing too, I'm sorry, the other thing to think about is that after the ESPN announcement, the first couple pay-per-views before this one, they seem to do better than when people thought they would do. And part of the reason might be that ESPN is great at marketing MMA to the masses, because ESPN is, so many sports fans just naturally check out ESPN, so it makes it a much better promotional tool than Fox was. So I would wait, because after they get the bugs out and ESPN is going to be throwing their full weight behind future pay-per-views, the numbers might go up, might be higher than we suspect they would have guessed they would be. But there is a possibility, because that double paywall, that it's going to keep and it's harder for people in certain parts of the country to get. It's going to keep a lot of people away. It's definitely going to hurt the pay-per-view numbers overall. That's my guess. But again, I think we talked about this briefly on Twitter and stuff. It's as much as it did worse, people I think are also jumping again, thinking this is a disaster for ESPN, because ESPN doesn't need nearly the sales the UFC did to recoup the money they're giving the UFC.
Yeah, and what do you make of sort of like another thing is like so you said the ESPN is doing good at marketing. So one of the things that I noticed was like during the Golden State Warriors versus Houston Rockets game, they were running UFC promos, and ESPN has like a little ticker at the bottom of the screen. They pretty much always throughout the week had a UFC 237 promo. Same thing with the ESPN Plus cards. So is that sort of what you're referencing, and what else?
I think definitely. I mean, because ESPN is a source for. I mean, the Fox deal didn't turn out to the big pay-per-view driver that they thought it was. Partly because, as much as Fox has sports, people only tuned in really for when those, like the football game or something, was on a Fox network channel, Fox Sports 1 College. ESPN, if you're a sports fan, there's a lot of sports fans that just leave ESPN on for Sports Center, for the ticker, whatever. And so it's easier to advertise to them. It's easier for them to hit you as a sports fan that's maybe not a UFC or casual or former UFC fan that's like, oh yeah, I'll check this out. They also have, because more people tune into their packaged, their sports reporting shows like Sports Center, they have a better chance of putting packaged marketing tools that draw attention to the event coming up than Fox did. So it's a much better promotional tool than they had before, promotional partner, I should say, than they had before. It's very much like the first days of Spike, when Spike was the UFC network. Now, ESPN's not going to be that, but ESPN is a massive, channel with a very loyal fan base, although it's dwindling, but still it has I shouldn't say loyal, but very tuned in fans who are sports fans that are the type of people they want to sell this to. And so they're able to reach them directly.
Yeah. And do you think, and I don't know if this is right, and I'm just sort of want to get your general take on it, but I was thinking maybe after a year or two, once ESPN, checks all their numbers out, if maybe things aren't going as well as they thought it would they maybe stop that as much? Like for ESPN Plus, the initial rollout, they had guys like Henry Cejudo on First Take, and they were bringing on guys like John Jones on the Stephen A. Smith Show, etc. And that's sort of slowed down. So do you think that that is something that could happen, or do you think, ESPN is all in? They even brought in the PFL, which we'll get to into a second. So do you think that it is that black and white where it's like, oh, if the numbers are going good, we'll raise our marketing, but if not, then we really will just keep it ho-hum and just, you'll get that little ticker spot and that's about it. Do you think there's a correlation there at all?
Well, I think part of the reason there was a big rollout when they did it, because it was a rollout. They wanted to, make a big splash in ESPN Plus and the ESPN deal. And so they brought bigger names and had the big fight on, the big fight right away off the start of the year with Cejudo and Dillashaw. But the whole point of that is to get MMA fans, the hardcore, the biggest UFC fans, signed on to ESPN Plus right away. So they're paying. So now that they've got them, and they got them into it right away with the big splash, and from all accounts that the UFC added 1 million plus or whatever subscribers to ESPN Plus. Now that they're there, they can just put the typical UFC show because their subscribers are going to pay monthly. The next step is the less hardcore fan, to get them to subscribe. And the way to do that is with the pay-per-views, which sometimes draw fans in and sometimes don't, depending on who's on the card. Well, if you have to sign on to ESPN Plus to get the pay-per-view, slowly, as you hit some, it might not be much at first, but eventually when you get to the bigger pay-per-views and people really want to see it, you'll see an uptick in the numbers of subscribers. And then the hope is that they'll just forget to not, to get rid of their ESPN Plus subscription because it's cheaper to keep it for the next pay-per-view. And so people year round, even though they might only buy 2 pay-per-views a year.
Yeah, and with all of this talk about ESPN and UFC, the one thing which I slightly alluded to is that they also added PFL into the mix. They signed a deal with them. So I guess I'll ask you the same question I did at the top of this. When you heard that news, what was your initial reaction to that, the PFL signing on to ESPN?
I guess I wasn't totally surprised because I heard PFL was looking for a new network. They were hoping not to go back to NBC, was my understanding, that there was another channel they wanted to go to. So I wasn't 100% surprised. I mean, if this was a few years ago, I'd been flabbergasted because UFC was very protective of its broadcast partner. It's TV rights at all. I remember they put fights on Versus. They made the WC bottom and put them on Versus just to block anybody else from getting on that channel, the Outdoor Network at the time. So they're very protective of their domain. But I think this tells us, one, is the UFC is such a gap between them and everybody else. They're no longer concerned. And I guess it also tells us that ESPN just wants more content. I mean, the PFL numbers, from my understanding, I haven't heard the official numbers, but stuff that's been floated, it's their TV deal's not, compared to the UFC, it's not spectacular. It's enough to stay afloat, but it's nothing compared to theirs. So they're not, I guess for the UFC, they're not a threat, and there's more content, and so they're there.
And for the PFL, from their perspective, what is sort of, I don't know how else to say it, but what's sort of in it for them? You see, like, yes, they're on it, but one of the things that I noticed was during their own broadcast, they're reading UFC ads. That ticker that I referenced earlier, that's during the PFL broadcast. So I guess sort of like, what is it what's in it for PFL? Is it sort of like, oh, we can be under the ESPN umbrella as well? Or like, what else have you noticed that you think like, okay, PFL, they'll be able to benefit from this deal going further?
Well, I mean, PFL is on the same network that the UFC is, so you have a much better chance. And UFC is the 800-pound gorilla, who draws a lot more eyeballs. So you have a lot more chance that people that are UFC fans or MMA fans tuning into ESPN are going to check out your product instead of searching for it. They don't have to search for it now. Now it's there. And ESPN, because they're great at marketing, they can actually market your product, and who knows, maybe they'll be running advertisements or links or whatever when during the UFC events. It's a great deal for PFL. I mean, I don't know money-wise, financially, if it makes sense, but just to get the eyeballs on their product and expand it, in that sense, it's a great deal.
Yeah, and another promotion that was also in the news along with the PFL was One Championship, and they have sort of been in the news for weirder reasons. And I just sort of want to dig into that because, at least for me, it is a little bit confusing because they make a lot of outlandish statements, and it's sort of hard to get confirmation or on pretty much anything related to One Championship. So just all right, I'll just start at the top. They made a announcement about agents, and they have new requirements and things like that. Can you dive into what exactly that is? But can you boil it down for the listener? And then, like, what is your reaction to that? Like, a promotion now setting hard guidelines for agents, something that, at least to my understanding, we haven't really seen before, or someone like come out and make it as a part of the criteria for their fighters.
I mean, one word describes it to me as absurd. What they did is One Championship made an announcement that they are going to have guidelines for agents. They're going to have a certification process that you have to meet all these requirements to be a manager agent for fighters, for one athletes, fighters in one promotions. Those guidelines include a college degree, include you have to live a year in Asia, that you have to have 10 years experience in martial arts. You can have no criminal background or any other background of, screwing over fighters. All that sounds great. They're like, well, look, the other major league sports in America does it. NBA does it. NFL does it. Major League Baseball. But the truth is they don't do it. The Players Association for those ones do it. And so to me, it's absolutely absurd that a promoter who has no fiduciary responsibility towards players, They're a promoter by definition is in conflict with a manager and agent, because a promoter is trying to make as much money as possible by paying athletes the least, have any say in who represents a fighter. Now, all those rules might be great if the fighters themselves came up and said, these are the requirements that you have to represent us. But to have an agent, a promotion, make the decision who can represent fighters is ridiculous. I mean, it's absurd, as I said. And on top of that, one, they announced it a while ago. I guess they started a while ago, but they made their big announcement a couple of weeks ago or a week ago that they have their one talent agency, in which they're going to represent a select group of fighters, which is a complete conflict of interest because I said a manager agent has a fiduciary responsibility to their athletes, and a fiduciary responsibility, for people that don't know, is that you have a responsibility to act in their best interest, especially monetary wise. Promoters in conflict of that. A promoter's interest is making as much money as possible for the promoter, not make as much money as possible for the athlete. So it's, again, all this goes in conflict. Like there's the Ali Act says you can't do that. Of course, Ali, it doesn't apply to MMA, but several states have regulations on their state statutes for athletic commissions that you cannot be a manager and a promoter. So I guess one would be to point out again how absurd the whole situation. Two is one might not have, I guess, plans to come to America, because there's several commissions, I think, that they would have trouble getting licenses under doing this behavior.
Yeah, and I do remember a few years back there was a noise that WMEIMG, they were representing fighters as well. So is that somewhat similar to that? And if not, what is sort of the difference in that?
Well,
is that?
It's very similar, and there's a lot of arguments that they're violating it too. That those commissions. The difference is William Morris claims that they don't manage people's fight careers. It's always stuff outside the fight, like acting jobs, Ronda Rousey, or modeling engagements. That's their argument. I'm a little dubious of that difference that they claim, because WME Endeavor, running the UFC, they market the UFC and their athletes for products all the time, and they use their athletes as models and representatives of those products. So while William Morris can say, hey, we represent a fighter outside the UFC, but a lot of the times the thing you're representing them for, signing the deal, the endorsement deal, is going to be in conjunction with the UFC. So are you looking out for the best interest of the fighter, or are you using that fighter to get the best deal for the UFC, i.e. William Morris Endeavor? That's why I'm a little dubious of that whole situation. But it's not nearly as egregious as what one seems to be doing, where they're going to represent the fight career. So your agent is going to be your promoter, can be your agent, who represents you in the cage.
That I mean, I don't feel like that's too hard to see how that could easily create a sticky situation. Now, another thing.
I mean, this is the whole reason why the Ali Act was passed, because Don King used to do this with his son. His son was the manager of his boxers. And so is his son, who's managing boxers, is he looking out for his boxer's best interest or his dad's best interest?
Yeah, and another thing, just to keep going, it's like I feel like I'm just on here bashing when I'm not, but there's just a lot of things that I don't understand when it comes to them. So on their broadcasts, they like to throw out the word billion and say that we broadcast over billions of people. And you look on their social media, and there's, I'll just call it weird things I noticed with some of their social media numbers. So I guess I'll just ask you: is there any validity to their claims when they say things like, "Oh, we're broadcasting over 2 billion people," and just things like that? Is there any validity? And if not, how do they get away with this without anyone sort of checking them? I know there was reporting done. I do believe by Paul Gift that, I do believe it was Paul Gift that just dove into their financials some. So just what do you make of that? Like when they throw out these bold claims of that word billion, what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, the thing about one is they really have raised a lot of money. I did a report on their finances, and then Paul Gift did one as well. So on that front, we can say they've raised a lot of money. But a lot of the other claims are really, really, really either false or apparently false, or seem to be false, I should say, allegedly false, so no one can come after us for that, but also that they're unverifiable. If you look at the numbers that they say billions watched it, or pretend, not billions, that's the joke, but millions, they say like 50 million watched this event or whatever, ridiculous, number. Well, one is, how are they quantifying that? They don't really say. Then they say Nielsen reports it, but you contact Nielsen and they won't confirm that number. They say you should go to one. Well, I mean, one's claiming you said that and you'd confirm it, but now you're not really confirming it. You're telling us to go back to one. And then there's a very questionable thing about one's relationship with Nielsen. I have a lot of questions about that, because one seems to be very friendly with them. The Sports Nielsen Sports out in Asia, and an executive from Nielsen Sports is now working for one. You can't say anything specific about that. Oh, that's obvious sign that there's some sort of corrupt link. No, there's no evidence of that, but it does make you question, what the relationship between the two is. And then you go to people like, there's a guy called Globe SVCS, Jonathan Colloon on Twitter. He follows one very closely. Some other guys, there's a lot of guys that actually do this on Twitter. So you look at their numbers, they say, and then they'll show you the actual ratings that come out of certain countries, and they don't add up. They're not like in Japan. They said they have this huge success in Japan, but their Japanese ratings were way down there compared to everybody else's, very low ratings. So the numbers don't quite add up. Their finances don't look good based on what we've seen up through 2017, or actually up through 2018, I believe now. So, a part of it, to me, my opinion, just my opinion, has, not based on fact, is that one likes to make these statements because they're raising money and they want these investors who probably don't know much about MMA just do Google searches and see, oh, look, we did a Google search and look how, there's great news coming out of one. Yeah, okay, we're willing to, take a chance and invest money in the promotion.
Yeah, and another, or I should say the last sort of major promotion that has been making moves. We talked last time about Bellator and DAZN, and one of the things that I sort of noticed was this is not, or at least how I'm looking at it, is between last week and the event that they had yesterday, it seems like, how do I say, I don't know if I should say they're taking some of the buzz away from the UFC, or it feels like they're somewhat sort of hitting their stride. I've noticed DAZN, they're starting to do different things with how they decide to promote the fights that are coming up. They're, as far as their highlights, they're very proactive with putting highlights up, and that's something that ESPN has stopped doing, mainly because I feel like a lot of people asked for it. So what do you make of that sort of, like, it feels like this sort of stride that Bellator is starting to hit on? Is there anything to that at all, or is there still, like you said not too long ago, is there still so much ground to make up that the UFC is just not worried at all?
Well, I definitely don't think the UFC is really worried about Bellator. I mean, it's the UFC, again, is the 800-pound gorilla. With the new pay-per-view deal, the UFC is supposedly guaranteed another $200 million in guaranteed money, plus $300 million in the ESPN TV deal. So you're talking, $550, $600 million in guaranteed money before even anything else comes in. So UFC's, my understanding was that Bellator is projecting like $80 million in revenue this year at the end of this fiscal year in September, which is a lot more than any other non-UFC promotion since Pride. At the same time, UFC is probably expecting over $800 million. So that's a huge gap still you have to cover. I think Bellator is looking better and very, very recently. I mean, it has been great for them so far in DAZN, because ratings have gone down on the Paramount Network, just plummeted. Subscriptions on DAZN are not super high. They've kind of been out of sight, out of mind to a lot of MMA fans. There's not a lot of big new signings by them, so that you're not hearing, hype about other new UFC fighters going there. So all that's kind of, hurting them. But they are doing a pretty good job, I think, DAZN is, of putting their promotional weight behind them, even though DAZN doesn't have many subscribers yet. But they are including them when they talk about Canelo. They put up Chandler versus Pitbull, and that's, to put them in the same breath, that, oh, Canelo, Triple G, and Chandler were in the same breath. That's a lot of hype behind someone. That's helpful. You're talking about, not putting images on the internet. DAZN posted video clips of the MVP knockout by Lima all over the place. Even ESPN was retweeting or posting the clip. So it's getting out there that sort of way. But I don't think it's, when Strikeforce was around, there was a paywall to get for Showtime. The Zone is still a much bigger paywall, a much bigger barrier to casual fan interest than Showtime was. So right now, my gut feeling is that the Bellator audience is really limited right now to only hardcore MMA fans and boxing fans that are casually interested in MMA who are signing up for the Zone. So that's limited their pool of fans. But again, the good news is for Bellator is that DAZN apparently has a lot of money they're willing to spend, and they've decided that Bellator is their product for an MMA fan base. The biggest problem for Bellator right now is they need more fighters, more stars to draw fan interest, and there's just not a lot out there. There's not, especially not a lot that are testing the market. Boxing, it's crazy how many guys are jumping broadcasters, promoters left and right. We're just not seeing that in MMA.
Yeah, and another thing that also comes up when you talk about this, a lot of people they like to throw around like things like YouTube numbers and Twitter followers and things like that. And so I'll just get your opinion on it. Monetization is a thing that I feel like is going to start to become a conversation in MMA, like YouTube monetization and putting your content on these different platforms. So for the listener, can you explain how, say, if I have 100,000 subscribers on YouTube, that does not necessarily mean that my actual app is doing well? Like, is there a correlation there? Because that just seems to be something that I'm starting to see more people say, like DAZN, like they're like, oh, look at DAZN's doing well. Look, their highlights are getting 250,000 plus views, and they have they're growing 25K subs and so on and so on. But can you explain that? How do you look at that? Like, yeah, a bunch of free content may be doing well, but the app not so much. Can you sort of explain that and break that down at all?
Well, YouTube monetization is great if you don't want a lot of revenue. I guess WWE makes pretty good money because they post millions and millions and millions of views every month. But for most people, your subscribers, if you have a channel that has 100,000 subscribers, that's a great number to start with if you're an individual YouTuber, because that's, you make your product yourself, you're going to make the money. If you're a corporation, 100,000 is not going to go far. If you have a huge overhead with hundreds, of staff and hundreds of products, and employees and materials and contents you need to get, so 100,000 is not going to spread far. The subscription level, the whole thing is they just want subscribers. They have around 4 million supposedly right now. That sounds about right, because they supposedly have like over 1 million in Japan, 1 million in the German-speaking countries, 1 million in Italy, and they're now in Spain, Canada, the U.S. So 4 or 5 million. That's $10 a month. That's 600 million a year. Of course, that doesn't come close to covering what they're spending every year in sports content. So DAZN, their big thing is they just got to draw more people willing to pay for the subscription. Same with ESPN Plus, but more so for DAZN because they're 100% dependent on it. So the thing about it gets me is people look at the boxing numbers and they say, oh, how does DAZN stay in business? As much as they're paying boxers, that's just a fraction of their total expenditure. And my fear is if DAZN's successful, they're going to go after big stick and ball sports. And if they start putting money in that, they might not care about boxing and MMA anymore. So that's the catch-22. You want DAZN to be successful because they're putting a lot of money into combat sports. But my fear is if they're super successful, they might not care about combat sports and might decide, hey, that's one area we don't have to put much money in.
Yeah, and I could see that. Now, I guess on the flip side of that, like we saw one thing that last time I did completely miss or fail to mention was how DAZN, it felt like after a couple months after the launch, they raised their price. And with ESPN, they rolled out the deal, and like we said and talked about, after a couple months, they now added pay-per-views to that. So what do you sort of make of that? Sort of like this, like the shape shifting of it all. Like it feels like if things go well, like everything is sort of calm, but if not so much, like they will be willing to just raise the price and not think anything of it for the consumer. So is there anything there, or do you think that for the most part, when we talk about these apps and sort of the health of them right now, that things are pretty much like set in stone right now? Like, do you foresee over the next year or two any sort of other changes? Have you heard of any other apps? Like I know, I think it's Bleacher Report. They broadcast one's fights, and also they also broadcast on Periscope. Like, are there any other sort of smaller players that you think are going to try and make a jump to it? Do you think that the health of these apps is sort of good, or are we in for more shape shifting over the next year or two?
I mean, I'm not an expert on this stuff, and I don't follow a lot. I know there's a lot of like small promotions always trying to get into it because they need a source of revenue, but I don't see them making much of a splash. On the changing of the prices, I think ESPN is going to stay at $5 for a while, and they have a lot of, because Disney is flush with so much money. They're going to be willing to lose millions upon millions, maybe billions, to finance these streaming services, and they're going to have the advantage that ESPN can be. I mean, ESPN's price, the plus price, will probably go up unless you get it as a package deal with Hulu and the Disney Channel. So eventually that might happen because they're going to want people to subscribe to all three, but that'll help funnel subscribers into it. So get more there. The pay-per-view, the whole point of getting the pay-per-views is they want to find a way to force people to get subscriptions. So they did that. I mean, it adds a price to it. Pay-per-view is not disappearing completely, but it's slowly vanishing as it's being streamlined into being merged with streaming services. And going back to the whole ESPN Plus deal with UFC, ESPN Plus, and the pay-per-views, the good thing for ESPN is they get to keep almost all the money from those pay-per-view sales. So even though technically, if they were selling as much as they are, you'd think they'd be losing money. They're keeping all the money, so they're making back a lot of it. So that they don't have to sell nearly as many as the UFC did to make the same amount of money. For DAZN, I don't really see it as a price increase as much as an attempt to influence people to get a longer subscription, because you can get a year subscription that's even cheaper than $10 a month, $100. But the whole point of the $20 is they were probably finding is that now that we have Canelo, and now that we have Joshua, now that we have Triple G, people are just going to sign on for the months they want, pay the $10 and quit. And if we do it for $20, it might be an incentive to say, oh, screw it, I'll just keep it for the year. I won't sign on, sign off. So that was just a tool to get people to not just pay for the 1 month. I figure as DAZN keeps going in the fall, if they have a bunch of big fights signed this fall in DAZN, and they were trying to get Wilder Joshua, I know, and Triple G Canelo will probably be made this fall. If they have a big 1-2 month, they might even jack that price up more. I could see them making it $25-$30 a month just to make sure that people aren't taking advantage of those pay-per-view quality fights just for that 1 month, and that they're subscribing to the full year, because full year at $10 is $120. I guess they're doing for $100. So $100, it's the price of 1 or 2 pay-per-views.
Yeah, and also the last time we spoke, I sort of asked towards the end, I just sort of laid out and said, do you think that the ESPN deal and Bellator, DAZN, and so on, is that good for MMA? Well, now we've actually had a handful of cards. They've added pay-per-views to the mix, and like we just said, Bellator is doing DAZN rather is doing things like posting their highlights and things like that. And while they may not be making a lot of money off of things like YouTube views, they are at least getting it out there. So we're in May now. Do you think that it has been good for MMA? Have you noticed that just for all parties involved, like, has it gone more or less how you thought it would go? Things like ESPN putting their different spots and adding PFL, and Bellator sort of doing all the things that they're doing. Has business been pretty much what you thought it would be, or has there been any drastic change where you're like, oh, I didn't see that coming, that's a little bit interesting?
Well, I'm not really. I don't do that. I'm not much for predicting what's going to happen in the business, because I'm not in the boardrooms of these guys, not making the plan. So I'm always caught off guard often by what's going to happen. I will say, It's I think there's two things to look at. On one way, it's been bad for it's bad. It's going to probably get worse for MMA, because this reminds me a little bit of what happened when boxing went off terrestrial TV in the 80s and went to HBO and pay-per-view. HBO started paying more. First, terrestrial TV, ABC and stuff didn't really want to show it because the big part of it was that the sponsors, the advertisers, didn't want to be on boxing because people had died in the ring and it was known as barbaric and everything. So they started getting away. And HBO knew that a hardcore boxing fan, that was a source of revenue. So they started putting big fights in HBO and people paid for the service. So it went to a subscription service, HBO, and then HBO started offering pay-per-views. But Bob Arum was one of the guys that really was one of the first guys that really pushed pay-per-view. So boxing waned as a mass cultural sport because there was a wall between the masses and the sport. People either had to subscribe to HBO to watch it or pay for an expensive pay-per-view. So it withered as a casual sport. In some ways, MMA recently succeeded because it was on Spike, which is basic cable, and then on Fox. So it was able to reach the masses again, kind of like what boxing was able to do in the 80s. But now we're moving in a direction, along with boxing again, that once, thanks to PBC, boxing was on network TV for a while and still is with Fox. We're now moving in a direction where it's again going behind a firewall on streaming services, pay-per-view, and non-basic cable. I guess basic cable, but a lot of people are cutting the cord on ESPN. So it's no longer on terrestrial TV. And so that's, that separates people. Oh, did you freeze up there, Nixon? I think I lost you. Or did I freeze up?
Am I frozen?
Oh.
Can you hear me?
No, now you're moving again. No, now I can hear you. Now you're frozen.
Am I good? Oh,
I can hear you.
Frozen again.
No, well, your screen's frozen, but I can hear you. So are we still recording? Should I just keep going?
Yeah, I guess. Am I still going?
Your screen's all pixelated. No, I don't know if you're there or not. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can still hear you. Yep, I'm just.
Oh, I'll wait and see if you can get the camera working. You can edit this section out, right?
Yeah.
You're still kind of pixelated. It's weird. Your camera's all pixelated, kind of frozen. Is it mine? On my end, do you see me regularly, or is I am all effed up?
No, you're. I can see you just fine on it. Am I still like?
No, now you're moving. Now you're a little pixelated, but now you're moving good. You're not freezing like you were. Now you look good. Okay, now it's coming in focus. You're getting okay. It's better now.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Am I good? Am I?
Yeah, yeah. Now I can hear you. Now I can see you.
Okay. All right. All right. So ESPN. What? Just from your perspective, like, how do they seem to be reacting to all of this? Because I mean, there's just not really too much outside of them saying that they had received over 2 million plus subscribers, and it seems like Brett Okamoto, who's a journalist for them, it seems like he pretty much funnels any type of news through. They sort of use him to get any sort of news out. So from ESPN's perspective, how do you think they're sort of like reacting to all this? Do you think that they are impressed at the numbers that they see? I know we talk about analytics a lot, but are they sort of impressed by this? How does this move to MMA and bring in the UFC and then PFL and then adding 2 years on to the UFC's deal? Do you think that from their perspective, they're pretty much impressed with the product, or like you foresee? I know you don't do predictions, but could you foresee a world where they like it so much that they want to re-up the deal? How do you think ESPN is sort of like operating with all of this?
Well, I think they're happy. I mean, from all accounts, they seem to be ecstatic for the numbers they got. I remember boxing reporters were talking about how happy they were with Top Rank numbers. First with the ratings, because it was actually cheap programming for them. They're getting good ratings at ESPN. But then when they put them on, they upped the deal with Top Rank and they started doing the ESPN Plus deals. They were super happy with Top Rank. And by all accounts, the UFC's like dwarfed the number of subscribers that Top Rank brought in, like 3 times as many. So I'm guessing they're very happy. I mean, they signed the deal. They bought up their pay-per-views. Obviously, they see the UFC as a way to funnel fans into being subscribers and increase the number of subscriptions for that service. So it's a big win for all of them, I guess, on that front. And you can tell too. I think they're throwing. You see a lot of ESPN coverage. I mean, UFC coverage on ESPN, and they wouldn't be doing that, I think, if they thought it was a failed effort.
Yeah, and do you think that there's sort of anything like any other sort of changes or room for growth here? Because like we sort of talked about, like the pay-per-views, you said that they are good at marketing and things like that. So moving forward, what other things could you foresee? I know that ESPN has sort of kicked up how they talent acquisition, and they extended, well, not ESPN, but nonetheless, Dana White did get an extension. So is there anything to that at all? Are there any sort of things that when you look sort of down the road, you could see sort of changing from what the norm is now? I'm just sort of asking because as fans, we sort of talk about these things and people get caught off guard very easily. So now that I have here and I can ask, like, is there anything else we should sort of like, no, this is going to be the new norm, or is there anything else that you could sort of see at all just for the sport as a whole as it enters into this digital phase right now?
I mean, there's always something surprise that, they do something to surprise us. I mean, I've thought for a while, hasn't happened yet, and a lot of people think I'm crazy. I've thought for a while, even before Zuffa Boxing announced, is that Zuffa would get into boxing, or now I guess UFC Holdings, we should call them now. Zuffa, even though it still exists, they don't really use that. The company would get into boxing because MMA, there's still ways to expand it, but it's rapid growth, I think, is kind of ended. It's not going to be, blowing up like it did. So I thought they would get into boxing because then it would add another market and they could find a way to add more revenue to the company. I'll still wait and see if that happens, but I don't know. I mean, I'm sure they're working on stuff. I'm sure they have ideas. They built a huge center out in China. So obviously Chinese expansion's big for UFC. On the, product, they've made it. The Fertittas used to say it was after it was a big fight promotion, they started saying it was a lifestyle. So maybe they're going to go more in that direction. I'm not, that's way above my pay grade.
Yeah, but it definitely does seem like there's a lot of interesting things going on. So I guess to try and one last thing I did have about Bellator, do you think that moving forward, because last year, well, pretty much the past 2 years, there has been this sort of surge of free agency, and that sort of did die down. Do you think there's anything to that, like to where they could possibly try and do that again? And then, like for the fighters' perspective, like, do you think that there will eventually be a shift to where they start taking it into consideration what platform there are? And the only reason why I asked that is because Derek Lewis, he recently did an interview, and he was the one that sort of made it click in my head. He was saying, like, which version of ESPN am I going to be on? Am I going to be on main ESPN or the app? So is that something that you sort of think fighters are going to start taking into consideration? Like, oh, am I on the zone? Because I guess they do have to sort of lend a hand as far as getting subscribers as well. So is there anything to that at all, or is it just going to be pretty much how it is now?
Yeah, I don't think fighters, almost all fighters have too little say and too little options to give a say if they're going to be on ESPN Plus or ESPN, and there's just not the market of free agency that you have in boxing that we're going to see. A lot of guys weighing DAZN versus ESPN. You're either in one promotion or the other. So I don't see it being that big a concern, to tell you the truth. I think there's for some fighters, yeah, it might be a somewhat of a concern, but UFC fighters are not coming in with their own sponsors anymore. So number of eyeballs is not is not the big game changing, contract negotiating thing it used to be. You're stuck with the Reebok deal, so it doesn't really matter if you're on ESPN Plus or ESPN. I think Lewis's point too was that we're being used to bring in subscribers to ESPN Plus, but we're not getting a cut of that. And you're not.
Yeah, another Zuffa Boxing. I guess what's the holdup? It seems like once a year we hear like a little chirp about it, but nothing really has stuck, at least up now. So, what do you think could be the holdup? And do you foresee it actually becoming a thing?
I still think it's a potential. I think the holdup was that, Dana, from my understanding, Dana White for years has wanted to get into boxing, and it always made sense to me that the UFC is blowing up to a point where, hey, there's not much more you can expand right now, especially in North America. So let's add a boxing element so we can carve up, expand the market in a different sport. So that made sense to me. I think the holdup before was when he originally wanted to get into it, they didn't understand how much salaries were going to skyrocket, the costs, because of the competition between Top Rank and ESPN and DAZN, and with Matchroom and Golden Boy, and then PBC on Fox and Showtime. And so there's been a little sticker shock about how expensive it is to get into it. But I still think there's a good chance they do something. My wild prediction I had for a while, and Mookie Alexander at Bloody Elbow laughs at this, but my wild is that they might freaking offer a lot of money to do some sort of merger, buyout, whatever with Top Rank. We'll wait and see if that happens. It's just I'm just throwing that one out there. There's a chance that might not happen, but I have no inside information. I just took a wild guess on that makes some logical sense from Endeavor's point of view. But I still see him doing something with Zuffa Boxing. It might fade away quickly if boxing's a much more, there's not the profit margin there is in UFC MMA for boxing. So Endeavor could easily be scared away from it, but it does add a content for their portfolio for when packaging, TV deals and stuff. So in that sense, it makes sense to them.
Yeah. And another thing that, and this sort of, I guess, got thrown around on Twitter a lot was sort of this graphic of Canelo Alvarez's pay being $35 million, and it was like a little line, and it was Donald Cerrone, and it said he was like $400K or something. Basically, people trying to show that there's such a disparity there, and I saw a lot of different opinions on that. So, what is sort of your thought on that? Because as the MMA fan, it's sort of just a knee jerk to be like, oh, we should pay fighters more, but or at least from what I could understand, it felt like there was actually like solid reasons why, and that wasn't actually an accurate depiction of the argument that MMA fans have. So what do you think about that?
To me, it was a terrible argument. It was a terrible case to make because Canelo Alvarez is arguably the biggest star in his sport. And he's a massive draw on his own that would sell 1 million pay-per-views in fights before he went on, that he had basically 4 fights at around 1 million pay-per-view sellings, or no, I should say 5. You count the Mayweather. Mayweather was the A on that one. But Mayweather, the Cotto fight, the Chavez Jr., and the 2 Triple G fights all were like 1 million or more. So he's a massive draw. And nothing against Cerrone, but Cerrone has no track record like that at all. Now, there is a huge discrepancy between boxing and MMA pay. It's not 100 to 1 like that graphic kind of showed, but there's a big discrepancy. But I thought that's a terrible one. That's a terrible case to make using that as an example.
Yeah, and just again throwing it out there, that we all know, or at least I can't forget about the UFC's antitrust lawsuit. Anything at all going on with that? Any little tidbit you can share? Any update at all, if any?
Well, I guess the update is that they made the decision not till September are they going to have the hearings again, and that should be exciting because we have some big hearings. They're going to bring all the experts in for like a week and pit them against each other. They even described it as like an MMA fight, or there'll be the main event, Topel versus Singer, and then there'll be the co-main and the lower down the line with all the other experts, and then Joe Silva gets a day where he has to come in and testify. So there'll be an exciting week for dorks that like this sort of crap, exciting week in Vegas for that. And all of us, nerds from the show money and stuff will probably be there that week, nerding out. But besides that, we're going to have to wait until then. I mean, there might be some filings as we get close to it, and hopefully those filings include some unredacted stuff. But for now, there's nothing new.
Yeah, and what are some of the obviously we don't know yet because it hasn't happened, but just for someone that is just sort of listening in and they have no clue about it, what are some of the things that you think could be discussed? Because it feels like most people, they just see it as like, okay, the lawsuit is going on, but there's a lot of stuff where it can get into the weeds. So like when you say things like, okay, they're going to bring all the experts in, like, what does that mean when you say they're going to be going head to head?
Well, the two things is Joe Silva's in. They're going to bring Joe Silva in specifically to ask him about the UFC pay structure, and basically, was it structured in a way that was paid by tiers? In other words, was there a formula? Was it negotiated individually per fighter, or did fighters? You have a tier system that your pay was, basically predestined based on your position in the promotion, that you had no say in it. So they're going to bring that in to see if that's the case. So, and that's big for the lawsuit, because if fighters got their pay based on their, the record, their ranking, whatever, and it was structured that they went up tiers and there was all that they had no negotiating leverage, well, it makes the UFC fighters a class. So for class certification, that's a big deal. That the UFC put them in classes already, treated them as a class, not an individual. So that would say, oh, class certification. It's pretty simple because the fighters were a class. On the other front, the big argument is between Topol, who is an economist that's working with Zuffa, UFC, and Hal Singer, who's an economist working for the plaintiffs. And their big debate is going to be about wage share versus wage levels. And so the argument is, the UFC's big argument is that wages have been rising for fighters, and they have all this evidence that wages have been going up, which is probably true. In fact, I know it's true. Wages have been rising. Now, Singer's argument is that because the fighters are not really workers, they're basically products, that wage share is a much better representation. Wage share is not usually used in monopsony cases because monopsony cases are already rare. The situations where you'd use wage share are probably non-existent. But he's arguing that we should be using wage share, and that the percentage of the revenue that the fighters are getting has not been going up. That the UFC is getting a bigger cut all the time. Even if the fighters' salaries are going up, they're not going up to correspond with how much revenue is increasing for the UFC. And so that's the big debate on that front. And that'll, and that's a big debate. The decision the judge makes on that will decide should the case go forward or not.
What do you think? Like, because I'm obviously still trying to get educated on this. So, like, what do you think? Which argument do you think? Not what went out, but which one do you think is more, I guess, appropriate for MMA? Like I don't even necessarily know how to phrase it, but should it just be this thing where I guess the UFC sort of dictates the pay and it gradually raises over time? Or like you said, what Singer says that it should be more of a percentage based. Like, what do you think makes sense for MMA? Because, there's no unions and things like that. So when we talk about MMA as such a, I refer to it as the Wild Wild West. What sort of makes sense for that? I'm just like, if you could just define wage level versus wage share just from like a step back, like what does that even mean, and like how do you think that pertains to MMA?
I guess a good way to describe it is let's compare it to a regular job in boxing. Okay, let's say the UFC was McDonald's, right? And McDonald's kept expanding stores. So they're bringing in more and more revenue every year. Now they're making more and more revenue, and you look at their salaries, and you made $750 one year, $8 the next, $825 the next, $850 the next. You can say, the wages are going up the whole time. So obviously, McDonald's is not using its monopsony power because it's not stopping wage growth. And when I mean monopsony power, I mean that the UFC, it's when an entity, it's not the only buyer The definition under Webster's, it's when there's only one buyer of a product, then that's monopsony. Monopolies, there's one seller. That's the Webster's, but the legal definition is not that there's only one. Monopsony power is when because you're such a dominant buyer of something that you can dictate, control the prices. And so in this case, MMA, the argument is the UFC is a monopsony because they're such a dominant power. They have like 85, 90% of the market share. They can control, they can dictate how much wages are paid the fighters, and the fighters are selling their services as high-level athletes. So that's wage share, the wage level. The wage share argument is that the fighters are a product, and like pro sports or boxing, if there's a lot of competition, the promoters are forced to make smaller and smaller margins to get the fighters because there's so much competition for them. And so if the fighters' pay is going up every year, but let's say the UFC's revenue goes from 400 million to 800 million a year, well, if a fighter's income goes from 10,000 to 15,000, he makes more. That's a wage share, but the percentage that the UFC is paying out to fighters has actually gone down. And so their argument is that if this was a robust competitive market, the fighters' pay would actually go up much more because they would have a much higher share of the revenue. And that's their argument there. So that goes to that. My personal take is, and a lot of fans don't like to hear this, is they seem offended by this. Actually, there's no argument when you speak to any sort of real economist or guy that's an economist that you described the situation in MMA. There's no real argument that the UFC has a monopsony, that they dictate the prices, right? That they control it. My big question is it an illegal monopsony? Now, I don't like the fact that the UFC has a monopsony. I don't like the fact that I think that the fighters who are the product risking their health are making much less than they could. But there is an argument to make that the UFC didn't do this illegally under the law, even under the old laws, because a monopoly is only illegal if you attained it illegally and you abuse it. If the UFC attained it not by getting rid of rivals and not by engaging in unfair practices to their fighters, but instead got the monopsony because they put so much effort in their brand, and the fighters just love, MMA fans just love the UFC, which kind of seems like the case at times, and fighters too. That's not illegal. That's just us and the fighters just being obsessed with the brand, that we are so obsessed with the UFC, we will only watch UFC, that fighters are so obsessed with the UFC that they only care about getting the UFC. Well, you've given the UFC all the leverage. The other argument, though, is the UFC went out of their way to make themselves the only brand by eliminating rivals, namely Strikeforce and Pride, and then using contracts and the leverage they have to sign the main guys into contracts that they can make sure that they can't go out to any potential rivals. So that's the back and forth on it. But, personally, to me, it doesn't matter either way. UFC maybe is an illegal monopsony, maybe not, but I personally would like to see the fighters make more, because no matter what, I still think they're monopsony, no matter how they attained it.
Yeah, and I guess before I get to the last question I had, is that an argument? Because that is something that often does come up. Like they brought up Pride and Strikeforce and things like that. Or I guess you may have just answered it, but is that an actual argument that you think will be used in court against the UFC?
It's already used in court. They've released documents, emails, and stuff that supposedly the UFC and emails to their attorneys or their attorneys to UFC, I can't remember which, describe the acquisition of Pride as purely a defensive move to eliminate to make sure they're off the market so they're not available to anybody else and acquire those fighters. Well, that's it. So what was the purpose of acquiring Pride? If the purpose of acquiring Pride was, well, this is just a great opportunity and no one else wants them, that doesn't hurt the UFC. If the purpose of acquiring Pride was, we want to make sure no one else acquires Pride, and we're willing to spend a ton and lose money on risk money on it because we just don't want to make sure no one else gets them, because if they get them, they're a potential rival. That's a little different. Same with Strikeforce. That did UFC, they bring it up in the case, did UFC, what was the reason behind UFC buying Strikeforce? If it was to eliminate them because they saw them as a potential rival or whatever, that's different than them just getting them because Strikeforce wanted to sell and wanted to get out of the business and came to UFC. So both of them have appeared in the lawsuit already. So
Yeah, and I guess to go back to that, because I'm just sort of like trying to digest what you said about that sort of week stretch where they're going to bring in different experts. Um, how does that work for someone that doesn't know anything about that? Is that literally like is everyone like sectioned off and no one is going to know what the other person is saying? So like Joe Silva and his expert that he has to go against, once they have their arguments, is everyone else going to be aware of what was said so they'll be able to adjust for when it's their chance, or does
Yeah.
it not work like that?
Well, Joe Silva's going to be by himself. He doesn't have to go against anybody. But the other guys, like Topol Singer and Blair and all the other guys that is in Ballast that'll be there, they'll go head to head. It's going to be, you're in court the day you get in court. They're going to have, they'll bring a witness up, one of the two experts. Let's say they do Singer first. Singer's going to be cross-examined. The judge might have questions for him. The not the prosecutor, but the plaintiff's attorneys will have questions for him. So will the defense. They'll go back and forth, and they'll bring in the other expert and bring up the arguments that Singer just said and put them up to Topol and say, hey, what do you say about this? Then they might bring Singer back to rebut those. So it'll be kind of a back and forth. That's what I understand. Maybe there's a potential the judge might want both up there at the same time and just go back and forth between the two sides and say, hey, you have to answer this than you do. But he wants a debate between these arguments between these guys. In the case of Silva, he's just going to be there, and the judge is going to ask. The judge wants him to answer specific questions, and then both the plaintiffs and the defense are going to get a chance to ask him some questions too. So it's it'll be very high drama in the courtroom for once. Hopefully we're allowed to stay in. We're supposed to be, but who knows? Maybe the Zuffa will ask us to exit the court, and then we won't get anything. But there's the sound of it sounds like there's a good chance we'll start hearing stuff about maybe the true wage levels, wage shares of the fighters, maybe some pay information, some other stuff about how they operate and how they sign fighters. There might be some very interesting tidbits there for the 12 dorks that like this crap.
Yeah, and I'm definitely one of the 12.
Yeah, you're a member of the 12. That's
yeah. So I guess to sort of wrap up about that, okay, so once that does go down, how much longer do you think this entire trial or case? How much longer do you think it's left in this process, or what are the next steps after that?
It could be if the judge decides that there's no case. A few weeks later, we could get a ruling that it was dismissed. If the judge decides that that the plaintiffs don't have a class certificate, can't be class, their class cannot be certified, we might get a ruling on that, which means then the fighters got to go around and file individual lawsuits they want to continue, or something along the lines of mass tort in their individual districts. So that opens up a whole new can of chaos and stuff. If the judge decides, yes, you are a class and that the case shouldn't be dismissed, then anywhere from a few weeks to a few months before the end of the year, I'm guessing, the judge will announce that they're going to start hearings. And if that's the case, then we'll start hearings in 2020 for the case. If we get that far, almost all antitrust cases at that point, I think it was 90% or something, go to settlement. So the pressure to get settlement just grows a lot on the UFC at that point. And so we might get a settlement before it actually goes into hearing.
Okay, so and again, I know I'm like skipping ahead a lot, but okay, let's say it does get to that phase and the UFC has decided, all right, we got to settle. What for the fighters involved? What does that mean for them? Say I'm a fighter that is affected by this. Like, what does that mean for me? Like, do I just sit back and wait for a paycheck?
Well, it depends. Let's say UFC doesn't settle, and it goes all the way through hearing, and the UFC loses, and the numbers thrown out are huge. Let's say the UFC loses, and they decide that the UFC owes the fighters $600 million. Right? Or yeah, 600 million. Well, because it went all the way through, treble damages hits in. You triple the damages to punish the promoter, the person that lost. So that's 1.8 billion they would owe the fighters. At that point, the UFC is going to appeal, and it's going to take a while to appeal. if the UFC decides to settle before that, then there's a whole negotiating. How much are we going to settle for? And then after they make the settlement, there's a price that the UFC has to pay out the fighters, and they'll get a check for all the guys that just sat around waiting for John Fitch and them to win this for them. The other thing is it's not just the money that's the risk for the UFC. If it gets into hearing, the fighters are going to ask for a remedy. And the remedy could be something like, you've got to let the Ali Act. We got to have the Ali Act for MMA, or you got to have. I think they actually had a remedy in the in one of them that they wanted 1-year contracts with no extensions. So, well, a 1-year contract with no extensions just drastically changes the UFC's business model. So, and they're asking the judge to put this remedy. So if it goes all the way to hearing and you lose $600 million, the judge could also say, here's the remedy that we're going to enforce too, as well. Well, that just, like I said, that just completely turns over the UFC's business model right then. So the UFC might decide, shit, we've got to settle before we get all the way to hearings. We don't want to risk treble damages, but also we don't want to risk that remedy. And even though we can appeal it and then we could drag on for years, it might be a good idea not to risk the remedy and change our business model. It puts a lot of. That's why getting past class cert and the dismissal. If you get past those motions, those two, the pressure starts to mount on the UFC to do some sort of settlement, because the risk of treble damages and a remedy is a huge risk for them, and that's why you get like 90% of all antitrust cases, these type of cases, settle.
Yeah, and does ESPN have anything to? Because that's another thing I sort of seen thrown around, is whole ESPN, they don't want their name attached to this. Is that true? Does ESPN have nothing to do with it at all, and they're just solely?
ESPN has nothing to do with it. They don't care. I mean, they just they care in a sense that they don't want this product that they're paying a lot of money for, the UFC, not to be as high quality and not to have the dominance over the market it had before. They might not like that, but I don't think ESPN, I don't think they're thinking about this case much at all.
All right, and the last question I sort of had to tie it all together is, I actually just wanted to ask for someone, because a lot of fans, me included, a lot of this is very confusing, and trying to keep up with it is difficult. So would you happen to have any open recommendations as far as any books, websites, maybe podcasts, or people we should follow on Twitter, anything else that would sort of help the fan that is trying to catch up to this? Like, what do you think would help them be able to further understand what's going on?
Well, probably the best source is Jason Cruz at MMA Payout. MMA Payout covers this the most. They have the most business coverage of any. That's all they do for MMA, business stuff. So Jason Cruz, Paul Gift covers it a lot. I covered a bit. We have a show podcast, the three of us. How convenient. Show Money, we do once every month or two, where we often talk about this. That's probably the best sources. Outside of that, there's not a lot of coverage of the antitrust suit except us three. I'm trying to think who else covers it. Occasionally some people will talk about it, but we're probably the only three that really cover it. If you're into antitrust stuff, though, and there's other sources from there's a good starting ground. Is I did an article before the suit was even filed or on the radar in 2014 calls "Is the UFC a Monopoly?", where I talked to Paul Gift, the economist from Pepperdine, and I'm spacing on the other guy's name, who is a former FTC attorney. I spoke to the two of them. We had a little round table to discuss it, and it kind of fleshes out a lot of the details we described here. So that's a good starting point. And then there's a podcast. We've had a few podcasts in Show Money dedicated to just the antitrust suit, so you can check that out too. But besides that, I can't think of anybody else that really covers it. I'm sure I'm spacing it. I'm sure someone else, and I apologize, does a good job, but that's all I can think of right now.
Yep, and for anyone wondering, I'll definitely have the link to that 2014 article in the description, so anyone can go and check that out. But before we get out of here, John, is there any shout outs, anything like that, any news updates coming up, anything like that you want to let the people know?
No, I mean, I guess happy Mother's Day, Mom, since it's Mother's Day. I doubt she's watching, but I got a few articles that's supposed to go out this week with Bloody Elbow. The only other, I do a podcast where we talk about fighting on Care Don't Care, if anybody cares, with Steph Daniels of Bloody Elbow and Eugenia S. Robinson of Aussie.com and Bloody Elbow. And you can find me on Twitter at Hey Not the Face, often not talking about MMA, but occasionally MMA, but often not. So be prepared if you want to hear, I tweet a lot about labor issues and antitrust and stuff like that on top of boxing and MMA. So it can be dull for a lot of people.
Sounds good. I would definitely say definitely worth a follow. So if anyone's listening, definitely click the follow button there. But once again, that's Hey Not the Face on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter at Nixon_speaks. And I'll see you guys later on in the week.